you mentioned the term PMC, which listeners of this podcast are familiar with. Pascal Robert has been a guest in the past, a very popular guest. And that's part of what I wanted you to talk about today is your research and writing about the professional managerial class and the role they play in not being an op per se, but in derailing a lot of movement energy and funneling it into these kind of identitarian movements that don't really have any connection to the material basis for change, substantive structural change. And I have a lot of questions to ask you about this because I think we're largely on the same page when it comes to this. But I have been having a conversation both here and on call-in with folks that call into the show about which populations are really worth trying to connect to and persuade, given that so much of the people who occupy not just the left broadly, but the left media space are members of the professional managerial class. I would argue, myself included, and I don't know how you self-define, but as a professor at University of California schools, here we are. And so one of the questions, I get this pushback back and forth, is it worth me trying to engage with my peers, the people that I went to school with, my friends and broader community? And also, is it worth tying it back to the conversation we were just having about 1-6, trying to figure out how to decouple so many kind of less informed, potentially well-meaning liberal voters who don't really understand the whole brouhaha over Lin-Manuel from the left, try to get them to engage differently with politics? Or should we just forget all of them and go straight to the worker?
Well, so here, there's some concrete things we could talk about here. And Dan Bessemer had a great article this week about how we're all kind of sad and depressed because it seems like the era of mass politics is over, and Bernie was like the one person who seemed to be able to mobilize mass politics. Every political movement seems very niche. We don't seem to be able to reach working class voices, working class people. But the thing that I want to remind us all of, we are the minority. We are 34% of Americans have gone to college. And of that 34%, maybe up to 2% go to elite schools and then continue higher education. So we're like a minority of a minority, and we talk amongst each other and we're debating finer points. But the majority of Americans have not gone to college, do not debate, or they're not on Twitter. They're not debating 1-6. They're trying to survive. And so as an old school leftist, one of the things that I feel like it gives me confidence and hope in some way is that that ordinary working class Americans don't care about these issues. They're trying to survive. And if there is a candidate or political person who can speak to that energy, that discontentment, that demand for a better life, those higher expectations, that can still be mobilized because they're the majority of Americans and nobody's talking to them and nobody's talking about their issues. I keep thinking 1-6, you're all going crazy, you're all having cows. But there are people who, 20% of Americans live below the poverty line. 50 million American children live below the poverty line, which is of that 50 million, 3 out of 5 have known hunger in the past year and a half, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm like, those are issues, real salient issues that you liberal NPR listeners don't pay any attention to. Give that some airtime on 1-6. Say maybe it's economic suffering and marginality that's created a sense of desperation. Or let's look at red states and see what's happening. Let's look at rural America. Let's look at rural African Americans. Let's look at how they're living. Let's feature them for as long as you're featuring these 1-6 crazies, the QAnon shaman, who you can just have an orgasm about talking about him and his vegan diet. There are people who don't have enough to eat in America, many millions of them.
But we know we know all of the structural reasons why that's not the case, why neither party is particularly interested in focusing on those kinds of things. And and we also know that despite the fact that, to your excellent point, most Americans aren't PMC, most Americans have not gone to college, although the number of people who've attended at least 1 year of college or secondary school is bigger than that 34%. And that's notable when we're having conversations about things like student debt cancellation, because some of the people who are most disadvantaged by student debt are folks who have the debt but don't have the degree to even marginally tick up their income.
And this is because, can I just pause here? This is because for-profit universities were completely unregulated. Under the Bushes, Obama tried to regulate them. Then Trump completely deregulated that sector, and they cold called working class people, African Americans, many of them. For-profit universities are raping and pillaging the working class. And a lot of the debt, it has to do with assumed student loan debt for people who were unemployed and promised work by Liberty University or National University or whatever these.
Yeah. I mean, if you're up late watching television like so many people are, you are inundated with these kinds of ads depending on what part of the country you're in. And you see very explicit promises about how much your wages can go up that just don't connect with reality, which is why there have been these successful lawsuits in some areas to recoup money led by folks like the Debt Collective and Asher Taylor, who we recently had on the show. But what I was getting back around to is the fact that even though leftists, sometimes we like to cite these numbers about how everybody is with us and there's more working people than they're not, working class people than the PMC, and it's the 99 and the 1%, at the end of the day, election season comes around and we know who votes. And as a member of the Bernie campaign, I was frustrated at times that it felt like we were going rah, rah, young people are with us, rah, rah, working people are with us, without doing the things necessary to create the unprecedented turnout among young people or working class people or poor people that you would need. And in lieu of that work, which is very difficult, by the way, getting people registered and getting non-voters to turn out, there was, I think, a naivete about the need to capture some percentage of senior voters. What Bernie got, like 5 or 10% of seniors. That's a ridiculously small amount, right? And that's the hugest voting bloc. There's a naivete about the need to have some ability to push back against the PMC narratives that occupy all of the journalism class, right? And are writing all of these articles about Bernie Sanders doesn't care about Black people and making working class folks who do pick up on those narratives as they filter through the media feel that someone like Bernie might not actually be an advocate for their interests because they're taking the lead from folks who don't share their own class interests. So I'm curious to hear you kind of engage with that.
Right. No, I totally get it. I totally get how there is a voting bloc. And they're not working class people. They're middle class people. They're college educated people. They're older retirees who are prosperous. And how do you carve out a progressive space for that block? That must have been so frustrating. And one of the things is they keep saying, like, money will do it. We'll just hire more organizers. We'll get our message out there. Well, I think that it was one of the most successful messaging campaigns for a socialist. You were responsible for part of that. I never thought I would see that in my lifetime. So I don't want to be a Pollyanna, but I feel like we build on that kind of thing. I mean, the capture of progressive politics right now is intense, right? Because if you went down the identitarian route, Brianna, you'd have a MacArthur grant. There are so many rewards for
still hoping for one day.
I mean, I don't want to say you're not. I mean, I don't want to exclude you from that because it could happen. It could happen. We could be talking in a year and you'd be like, Catherine, you know what? You said I was going to get one. I'm like, okay, I'm eating my words. But there's a liberal establishment giving rewards to members of the PMC who will betray working class interests or who will reinforce liberal centrist interests, which only reinforce the status quo, only reinforce culturalist narratives, because a lot of the 1-6 narratives were culturalist narratives. In fact, they were all culturalist narratives. Nobody talked about how the country was so seriously divided. And the other thing about the media landscape, and is something that we really, I think it's totally daunting, is that look at how much money the Koch brothers have. Look at how much money Clear Channel has to determine right-wing media. I think we do have this idea, and it's probably naive, that if we speak the truth in different venues, like your podcast, we'll capture and we'll will convince people, but it's like we have a tiny microphone, and Clear Channel has like a gigantic sound system. It's almost infrastructural. But I think what we can do, and this is one of the things that I think I can only do, is weaken the resolve of PMC liberals from within. Because I can't tell you how many people have been writing to me ever since the book was published from within social services employees. There's a NASA employee wrote me, lawyers. People are saying, like, I never could identify what was making me really angry about this. A lot of these people are first generation PMCs like me, and they feel like, I really believed in getting my degree and working to get somewhere in the world, doing good. And then I find myself just like helping the PMC consolidate its monopoly on virtue and objectifying working class people and disempowering working class people by making them the objects of NGOs. So many people from the nonprofit sector have written me, very early on when the book was published, a medical resident said, I don't want you to know who I am. I'm just messaging you this, but I cannot tell you how much discontentment there is in medical residencies. They're exploiting us. They're not teaching us to serve patients. And we're terrified because we have $300,000 in student loans and we all need to get money. And so there are a lot of people, we all need to get jobs to pay back those loans. So within the class itself, there's like so much discontentment, but it's totally disorganized. And if you listen to NPR, watch MSNBC or CNN, or listen to Vox or, Ezra Klein or Iglesias, you would never imagine that. You'd think like people in our class were like really happy, I have my job and I'm just like really happy and I'm really reasonable. I'm reading a lot of books. Like, that's so interesting. And it's like, where are you guys living? Are you living on the same planet? But your PMC world is really a nice little snow globe, Well,
it's part of that is authentic, right? Because those of us, people who are the disgruntled PMC, are trying desperately to consume both media and literally, consume, material things that will provide the happiness that the blueprint on NPR says exists. So, okay, I'm going to download my cooking app from New York Times and I'm going to buy my $300 Le Creuset pot or whatever that everyone was mad at VP Harris for buying, and I'm going to make this cassoulet in my studio apartment, and it's going to make me feel like this $200,000 of debt is worth it.
Yeah,
because I'm not working class. I have enough disposable income to buy something like a $300 pot. I got my Dutch oven on sale for $100.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I found myself, especially during the pandemic, really holding on to these tiny, silly material things that made me feel comfort in the absence of something more sincere. So like candle buying became my outlet. I can secure this $20 candle and make a little vignette on my coffee table that makes me feel like I really am a member of this class that I feel very unsteady in as I was, unemployed for all of that year.
It's using habits of consumption to create identity. And that's what they're really good at, because what the class does not want you to do is identify as a worker or someone who's alienated from your work or alienated from the political situation. Like the kinds of solidarity that we feel when we're fighting for a cause together, that's actually a really joyful moment. And that can take place, within a strike. When things are desperate, it can take place on the dance floor. There are all these ways in which, like, there's joyful association. The pandemic took that away from us, and the PMC, in dividing us into, little consumer bots, actually wants to take that away from us as well and create our subjectivities as people who want to just like maximize and optimize their own private spaces. And so I was going to I thought we were going to talk about open borders and everything. And so I thought, I really was thinking a lot about this. And I was thinking about how this is a project that's near and dear to my heart. And I don't quite know how to frame it this way. But I was thinking about coercive migration, right? And we'll talk about open borders later. And I was thinking about how displaced PMC people are and how we are rewarded for being able to move through the world very smoothly from DC to LA to New York to London. And we're all like sort of all of these consumption venues are very similar. And when my PhD students have to go out on the job market, the more mobile they are, the better, right? Because this class, and Robert Reich wrote this in 1990s, is a kind of like jet set symbolic. We're symbolic analysts, and we don't have any like material relationship to our work itself as material, and even to our environments. And I was thinking about like the Great Migration, right? 6 million African Americans moved out of the South because of Jim Crow, because of Southern racism and the sort of dead end of agricultural life, a life that they knew to go to Chicago, to go to LA, to go to New York. And what they found themselves in was, slums, working very hard in factories. St. Louis is another, and urban agglomerations. That migration produced enormous displacement, right? There's another internal migration that I would love to compare to this is the internal migration of 145 million Chinese peasants to the Pearl River Delta to produce all the things that we use today, like from our bras to our iPhones to this Blue Yeti mic. Everything on my desk probably has been made in that area. 145 million people left their homes, left their families, left the place that they knew. It was like dirt poor. I don't want to romanticize it, but they really felt like there was no hope. Just like African Americans, newly freed slaves, felt like there was no hope in Alabama, no hope in Mississippi. We go to these cities, for the Chinese with Shenzhen, for African Americans with Chicago, St. Louis, New York, LA, and you're just like a stranger. You're completely uprooted. And under, capitalist logic, it's like they're free to move, but it's actually coercive. And I would like to see, and Xi Jinping says like he's doing it. I don't know how far he's doing it, but what about building up rural infrastructure? What about making it possible for people to stay where they want to stay? I was going to circle back to this. Many of my working class students who are on the job market, they don't want to move from Southern California because they are taking care of a parent, or they're providing income to their moms if they live at home. They are taking care of siblings, or they have parents who are taking care of them. The working class life is much more fragile and actually interconnected. And when the myth of social mobility is you become PMC and then you're making enough money so you don't have to depend on anyone and you can move everywhere you want. And I feel like that's one of the biggest lies of capitalism, is this kind of this kind of displacement, the radical displacement, then the reward of your radical displacement with consumer goods. So that was a lie.
And I think I want to circle back to something that you said at the beginning, because I wasn't quite ready to get off of the subject of how to treat the PMC, because this is something that I've heard you talk about a great deal. And while I say I'm largely with you, part of me is really stunned by the extent to which in this conversation, there is a real wholesome acknowledgement of how disgruntled, how unhappy, how marginalized even members of the PMC are. You just mentioned your own grad students who would like to be able to stay near their family instead of having to hustle 3,000 miles across the country on a job market. This entire generation, there's Bloomberg articles every week proclaiming that we're ruining the economy because we're not buying homes. No discussion of why structurally we might not be able to do so.
Young people not buying homes.
Yeah. The millennials and under are worse on almost every metric economically than the generations above, right? We've ruined the diamond industry. We've ruined the home industry. We've ruined the baby making industry. Like nobody's doing any of those things anymore for pretty obvious reasons. And yet, despite the acknowledgement, you reference doctors who are so frustrated about their loan burdens and, not being able to similarly have that kind of professional flexibility, whether it's to move home and be a family doctor in a lower income community, whether it's a first generation PMC like yourself or myself, who feels like the promises of this class status were never really completed, or that there were downsides that were never really discussed. All of that seems to me to be really clear evidence that this is a population that could be radicalized. And I reflect on historical examples like French 68, and I think about how there have been these social movements where students and members of the PMC were at the helm. And I wonder if there is a tension, whether you see any tension between the way sometimes we on the left joke about and kind of castigate and malign, world's tiniest violin, whatever, but malign the PMC as this completely unhelpful class that's a blocker in the way of revolutionary politics, and the potential for them to be a really important part of revolutionary politics, one, because of their own class instability, and two, because of the power that they hold in society in terms of the media and all of these other spheres where they have, because of that power and more economic stability, perhaps a little bit more willingness to risk a little bit more.
I think that's a very, very legitimate question and a very legitimate critique of some of my positions. I've always said that as a class is like a petit bourgeois class, it follows in the footsteps either of the working class when it's in its ascendancy or capital when capital is in ascendancy since 72. You mentioned 68 and the sort of college radicalisms. I feel like that was a huge mistake historically that we have to repair, is that the 68ers and their boomers mostly believed themselves to be cultural vanguards, and they left and they were like more cosmopolitan. I want to talk about I actually did want to talk about PMC cosmopolitanism as being rewarding this kind of like placelessness and dislocation. And they looked on the working class as intractably racist, intractably bound to place, intractably for the war, the Vietnam War, which is a big dividing line. And it turns out that within, when we look at the polls in the from that period, that there was more support among upper middle class Americans for the war than among the working class, because it was working class sons and daughters who were being sent to the war. And if you were like a white shoe Republican at that time, you could still be like a centrist Republican. Your kid went to school, you went to the country club, and you could support like American anti-communism. But if you were a working class guy, working class person from an ethnic white family or an African American family, your son was probably sent to that war with no provision because he didn't go to college. And so I think that was one moment where there was a huge false dividing, a false sort of attribution of pro-war sentiment to the working class. And I also feel like the right wing was able to use these cultural issues to divide the left in the end, because the PMC was so successful. Like boomer PMCs were part of a kind an expansion of the class since 72, and there were a lot of rewards for them to believe in their own righteousness. There are fewer rewards for us now, and I think that is possible to look at PMC discontent and to frame it in ways that allow us to think of ourselves as workers with stakes in work and labor that the PMC of another generation just didn't want to see themselves as, because they were so invested in in culturalism. So I totally understand what you're saying. My experience, though, maybe comes from my just utter despair in talking to my colleagues about these issues, because I cannot tell you how many of them were Warren voters. They were like, well, I'm studying the issues. And, and I was just like, what the heck do you have to study? There's no test. Like, there's no quiz. You don't get 100 if you vote for Warren instead of Sanders. Sanders was like the B- answer. I was so infuriated. It was they had nothing to lose, Brianna. They had nothing to lose voting for Sanders. And yet they were like, he's not really serious. It's like, she didn't win a single primary. So who's the pragmatic choice?
Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.